Hello, my name is Rory Dalglish. I'm the minister of the Methodist Church in Haxby and Wigginton, and also part of the ministry team at Central Methodist Church in York. And as part of a series of reflections I've been doing and posting on the Haxby and Wigginton Methodist Church's website during this time of coronavirus. Today and every Thursday, we'll be having for the next 8-9 weeks or so, I'll be sharing some thoughts about the Bible, and not trying to convince you of anything particular, but just to give an overview of what it actually is and how it came to be what it is and what's in it, I suppose. This is not going to be a series of talks about what you should believe or that you need, or how you need to accept the Bible or not. It's going to be in some ways honoring the science of biblical studies, which is not very interested actually in how the Bible might be used in a faith context, but interested in exploring it as a piece of literature, as something people have written over the years, and something that people use in particular ways. So in much the same way as scholars might study Shakespeare or any particular poet or history or all kinds of genres of literature, scholars study the Bible, and part of that exploring is where it's come from, how it got to be in the form that it is, in the library of books that we have, how those came to be as they are, and then what they tell us about people's understanding of themselves, particularly obviously for the writers and for their communities as people of faith, exploring faith in the God of Israel, and then after Jesus in this newly emerging movement and experience of God in all that Jesus, the story tells us, unlocks in his life, death and resurrection. So if you're here because you're curious, then I hope you stay, because the idea is not, as I said before, that you are in any way hoodwinked or browbeaten into believing anything in particular about the Bible. But it is something that most of us come at with a degree of confusion, because it is such a big and bewildering collection of stories and types of literature written over a period of about, we think, 4,000 years, obviously, demonstrably edited, crafted, put together. Some of the oldest scrolls we have of some of the books are not the same as later scrolls. There's lots of evidence of the stories developing, growing, emerging out of an oral tradition into a written tradition. And then, of course, the question of translation, which is another whole field of biblical studies. There are, as of October 2019, as of last year, almost 3,200 different translations of either the whole Bible or portions of the Bible. That sounds like a big number, but there are at least 3,900 languages and dialects that have no scripture, no part of the Bible written in their own language. Now, for many of those, they're close enough to another language that they could read another language group's text. But it's still a staggering number of translations. I am South African. I speak English and Afrikaans, and I used to speak a smattering of Xhosa and Setswana, Sesotho, which are quite close languages. Not anymore, because I've been away a long time. My wife is German. One of the things we talk about quite often, and we reflect on and laugh about in some ways, is the way that individual words and phrases haven't just changed meaning within their own languages, but actually make no sense in translating them directly in another language. That local knowledge about what a particular set of words means is often lost if we come at those with ignorance, which we can't help, I suppose, if we don't speak that language in the first place. So it's a really complicated book, not just because it tells a complicated story, but because in the story, in the way we try to translate the story, we obviously half say things or overemphasize things, but in the attempts to translate scripture into languages we use and understand in everyday life, which is itself a story in terms of how the scandal of that became the normality of that into our modern era, there is the opportunity for us to hold the book and say, well, at least let's explore where it comes from. We don't have to ask the question yet about whether we believe it or whether we think it's factually, historically accurate. Those questions will emerge over the next weeks, and we can explore them a little. But biblical studies as a field is interested in the way the literature came to be as it is, and isn't, as I've said before, necessarily hung up on the validity, the historical accuracy, the truthfulness of the content. So today's just an introduction. Today is the first Thursday of probably 9 Thursdays, because I'll show you a bit later what I'm planning to cover as we work through the books as we have them in the Bible I use most often, which is one version in terms of which books are in it and which order they're in. I use the version of the scriptures that is most common in Protestant churches, in churches that are part of the Christian tradition in that respect. But other traditions include other books. The Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church and other traditions choose to include other parts of what they deem to be holy writing into their version of Scripture. And so there isn't even consensus about exactly which bits of it are Scripture and who decides why this bit but not that bit gets to be included or not. We don't argue about it a lot. We just have chosen to stake our claim in different places, although not vastly different places. So I thought today, this might be thoroughly boring for you, but I thought what I'd do is introduce you to the Bibles that I've got. So this is the first Bible I ever got. It's a little Gideon's Bible that I was given when I was 13 years old, and I started at boarding school in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I've written into it in handwriting that's much neater than my handwriting today. That it's mine, and I got it in 1984, and I was in Standard 6A, which is the class that I was in. And that was my very first Bible. I have my grandmother's Bible, my father's mother's Bible. It's a living Bible, so it's not a translation. It's not a scholarly work of trying to fit the exact word into the right phraseology for today. It's a paraphrase. So it's in a sense it's an attempt to take some of the convoluted language and make it much more simple, straightforward and plain. Some people would thumb their noses at that and say it's not really scripture, but there are all kinds of other translations that try to do the same thing. Try to say not what are the exact words that we need to accurately convey this word in either Greek or Hebrew, but how can we express what's being expressed in a way that makes sense to modern ears. My grandmother did something that is anathema to some people in that she wrote in her Bible. She underlined things, she ticked things, a lot of ticks. I haven't found many crosses so far, and much that she really struggled with or seemed to disagree with. And there are little prayers and things stuck in. She and my grandfather were people of deep, devout faith, and this was very important to her in her life, and I'm glad to have it. I also have my grandfather's Bible, which is a Good News Bible, which was until not very long ago a very popular translation. It's not considered particularly accurate, but it's very colloquial in the way that it tries to be true to being understood and true at the same time to the original words. And this was presented to my grandfather, James Dalglish. They spelt his name wrong. I'm used to that. On the occasion of your induction to the eldership of Frere Road Presbyterian Church, which I used to go to when I was a little boy at Christmas time. And I remember it well. This is the Bible that I got when I was ordained. It's a New Jerusalem Bible. And it has the certificate in it that says it was presented to me. They spelled my name right. Well done. Methodist Church of Southern Africa. On the 13th of August 2000. And it was a translation I didn't have. Because it's useful to have a number of translations. Because sometimes the meaning of a passage is lost in the literal interpretation of it, which might be helped by looking at it through another lens. So I got that all of nearly 20 years ago. In this little case, I have a New International Version. This Bible is particularly precious to me because I had one exactly like this and I lost it. I left it behind somewhere. I don't know what happened to it. And then a friend of mine called Barry Marshall, Barry was a colleague, a minister in Southern Africa. He had one just the same, which he had spare. And when I talked about it, he said, oh, you could just have mine, and gave it to me and wrote in it. And wrote in the back, Rory, I hope for a growing friendship, more passion, less cynicism, a real knowledge of God, integrity. Let's talk. B. Barry died very tragically, leaving a young family and a lot of grieving people who are still feeling his loss. Now, gosh, best part of 12 years ago, 11 years ago. And I think about him when I see that. This is one of my church's Bibles. I didn't pinch it, I've just borrowed it, but it is the New Revised Standard Version, which is considered by many to be the most helpfully accurate translation that we have. And it's the New Revised Standard Version because what the authors have done is they've also tried to go back and address some of the blatant sexism that's in the Bible in terms of the way that it talks about, in translating it, mankind, man. It's all him, his, man, and what they've done is tried to soften that while still being true to the text, so that it is more inclusive, which I think is a good thing to do. And it's the Bible we use Sunday by Sunday. This is a Thompson's Chain Reference Bible. It's also a New International Version. I don't use it as much as I used to. It's a good kind of reference text. I got it when I turned 21. It was given to me by Dave and Barbara, two fellow engineering students at the university that I was at in Johannesburg, and they wrote in the front. And it's been a joy in the last couple of months to have to find Barbara on Facebook and reconnect with her. I haven't seen her yet, but she's living in the UK, and she's also not an engineer, just like me. But I got that from them, and it's a particularly poignant kind of time in my life around that time, and that was precious. And then I have two other. You might wonder whether how many Bibles is enough. I have this, which is the Message. It's written by a man called Eugene Peterson, who doesn't claim to be a great biblical scholar, but has enough knowledge of the original languages to write probably the most radical paraphrase we have of Scripture. So he's written the stories in quite different language, in very down to earth language, and for many people it's been a really refreshing thing to read alongside the traditional passages, because it's less measured and less genteel and less, I want to say, spiritual. It's not as easy to read in a particular kind of tone with which we often read the Bible in church, with a solemnity and a seriousness that maybe isn't always needed. And then lastly, a translation by Nicholas King, who's alive, who's a Roman Catholic scholar, and who's written a New Testament translation, which is again just fabulous. I dip into it, and I know Nicholas, or I've met Nicholas, and I'm really grateful to have that. So that's my collection. You might think, gosh, when do I sleep with all these Bibles to read and things to do? I don't read all of them all the time. In fact, I don't read most of them most of the time. I dip into them as a way of trying to understand what I'm reading, because different translations out of different times in history, with a different emphasis, reveal different things. And that's the point. Each group of translators, each group of people who sit down, or as individuals in Nick King's case or Eugene Peterson's, what they do is sit down and try to capture the heart of what they think is in the Bible, and do so within a framework. They do so with a reason. So when the New Revised Standard Version translator sat down, they took the Revised Standard Version translation, which we've had since about 1950 something, I think, and they sought specifically to update the language where it needed updating, because language shifts and changes in its meaning, but also to do the work, as I've said, of making it more inclusive. Now, are they being true to the original text? Shouldn't it be exactly what was written? Well, I guess that's part of the point in terms of how we give authority to the Scriptures. And without this being an advert for something I did before, on Tuesday I posted on our church's Facebook page and on our YouTube channel and in a number of places the first of a series of talks I'm doing that are about being skeptical, and that being more than appropriate within a thinking, exploring, questioning, even suspicious attitude towards faith. And the first of those was on the authority of the Bible. So if you want to go back and find that, you're welcome to do so. So the Bible, there it is. Those are my Bibles, and we're going to be dipping into them, not to be overly scholarly, but more than anything to be, I guess, trying to ask what it is that we're holding, and where it comes from, and what's in it. That's not the same, as I've said already, and I will keep saying because it's important. That's not the same as saying, what does it mean, and what did it mean to the original believers, and what does it mean to us today? It will be more a case of asking who wrote it, and when, and for what purpose do we think they wrote it, and who did they write it to, and where does it fit into the whole of Scripture. So in the Bible I use most of the time, there are 66 books, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New, and they are grouped into categories. And those categories are going to be systematically explored over the next 8 weeks of exploring the Old and New Testament. How those 66 books came to be the Bible as it is again a bit of a bone of contention, because some people think that there were definite moments when certain early church councils decided definitively that this or that version of the canon, C-A-N-O-N, collection, really, not double N-O-N, which unfortunately is something the Bible's been used for quite a lot. It's been weaponized very recently in America on a lawn across from the White House, surrounded by tear gas. That the canon of Scripture, the authority, the reason why these books, I suppose, more than other books, are the places we keep going to explore faith and life and the story of God in human history, that's not at all clear exactly how it came to be. Over a period of time, over a period of quite literally hundreds of years, even thousands of years, up to the point of about 500 BC, the Old Testament as we know it was evolving and changing and clearly being edited, because in some of the histories, and we'll talk about those, there's evidence of different versions of stories being told in a way that tries to knit them together or just tells them completely differently across different books. As far as the New Testament goes, we know that the early church had the Old Testament. Those were their scriptures. That's what they had. And the early writings that came towards the middle and end of the first century took some time to be considered not just good to have, but actually eternal, I guess would be the best way of describing what it means to become part of the canon. Some writing that had eternal significance in terms of how it tells the story of God interacting with human beings through the story of Jesus and then beyond into the establishment of the early church. So it's all been a bit fluid, and there are gospels that were not included. There are a number of gospels which tell the story of Jesus quite differently, and we'll get to some of those when we talk about the gospels themselves. Why these ones, not those ones? Well, there are good reasons in some cases. But fundamentally, at different points in history, either through direct intervention by official bodies, or just through the fact of their usefulness and their longevity, proving them to be something that was valuable into the future, the books we have became the Bible that we have between the covers that it has. And so we're going to spend the next 8 weeks, exploring that. And I hope that will be more fun than it might sound, and not quite as dry as you might expect it to be. So what are we going to be looking at? Well, I'll give you some ideas. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to begin. Today we've had a bit of an introduction. The first session I do next Thursday will be a look at what's called the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of Scripture, which tell the story of everything from the early Israelites' understanding of how they came to be human and alive, the creation of the universe, right through to the establishment of the nation of Israel and the forming and norming around the rules that are part hugely of the Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers sections of that literature. How Israel came to be Israel and understand itself to be Israel, not just as a nation, but as a historical, physical place, rooted in temple worship in Jerusalem. So that'll be week number 1. And then we'll look at some of the histories. There are quite a lot of histories through the course of the early part of Scripture and of the Old Testament, and from Joshua right through to Esther, quite a number of books, Kings, Chronicles. We see the history of the Jewish people told through various lenses and in various ways, in contradictory ways, in competing ways, in ways that clearly came out of different emphases within the nation of Israel and the people who were recording its story. And then we come to poetry, which is a bit of a loose term for a series of books that really read like poetry. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, right through to Song of Songs. Books that are not historically accurate, that aren't storytelling, but are the expression of longing, desire, emotion, hope, hopelessness. Job as a piece of literature, exploring very powerfully the whole notion of suffering and trying to explain suffering. And a huge part of Job is essentially an extended piece of poetry that God speaks to Job in response to his questions. So we'll spend some time with the poetry. That's part of Scripture. And then the prophets, the major prophets, the minor prophets. The back half of the Old Testament is very much about prophecy and the way that God continued to try in the stories, the way the story is told, through individuals to speak to the nation of Israel, to remind them who they were, why they were there, what was most important. And again, those books have poetic elements to them. They have allegorical elements to them, but they are the story of in the minds of the writers and the tellers of them. The story of God needing to remind God's people why they were who they were, and what it meant to be themselves, and what was most important. And then we'll come to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the 4 Gospels we have, which basically, in a nutshell, tell the story of the life of Jesus, each in quite different ways. The first 3 with a lot in common, but we'll have a look at those. And then we'll spend one session looking at Acts, which is early church history. It's a single book written, we believe, by the same person that was primarily the author of Luke, in Luke's Gospel, and it tells the story of the beginnings of the early church and how the disciples and the apostles went out from after the events of the death and resurrection of Jesus and established the early church. Principally Paul, who then writes beyond that, or is given authorship of most of the epistles, which is a fancy word for letter. Letters to churches, letters to individuals, dealing with all kinds of practical elements, dealing with teaching, dealing with conflict, dealing with all kinds of bits of what it means for human beings to organize themselves together and get stuck doing that. Joys and sorrows, everything you can think about, and some really important passages that are probably more familiar than many, many others in the minds of people who don't go to church, because they've become popular music and they're used, especially in weddings and in other moments, to capture in their beauty some of the longing and hope we have with each other. And then very lastly, why not go out with a bang? New Testament prophecy, the Revelation of John, a hugely problematic book, and the very last book, in a sense, to come into the canon of Scripture, to be agreed as part of the story of God, saying something quite strange and full of imagery and just it's a strange book. We'll spend a bit of time with it and do our best to do that. So that's the plan. To spend the next 8 weeks, from next Thursday onwards, systematically going through those sections of Scripture and asking, where are they from? Who do we think wrote them? Not how historically accurate they are, but what does the way they tell the story tell us about the shaping of the foundations of faith, and maybe why are they trustworthy? Maybe to question or explore the historical accuracy of parts of them, but certainly just to give an invitation to the structure of the Bible, because it isn't just a random collection of books placed together randomly. Each book is there because it's been deemed worthy, and it's in a section of writings that seem to fit best with it. It's not in chronological order. Certainly the Old Testament is older than the New Testament. That's fairly obvious. But within each, the books aren't necessarily in chronological order, but they are fitted together as part of what they say to us about God and the things that those who wrote them want us to know they believe to be true about God. How we wrestle with that, how we make sense of that, is what we do in church, really. To explore, to to reflect, to ask how our lives resonate somehow with the lives of those we read about, to ask whether we trust the stories as they are, to ask what they reveal in the best and worst of the writers, and perhaps the best and worst of ourselves. And they give us very practical and challenging opportunities to explore things like love and grace and forgiveness, and root them in not just our own stories, but stories of those who've gone before us, who tell us that they are some of the foundation stones of a life that is at least asking questions about faith, if not saying with confidence that we are followers of Jesus or people of faith in some way. So there you are. I hope that's been a little less dull than you thought it might be, and I hope that you'll join me. Welcome to my study. If you haven't seen my study before, it's a bit messier than it usually is. We have two guinea pigs, Derek and Jamie, who over my shoulder are running around a little bit, or they might be having a snooze now, I don't know. But they share the study with me. And maybe it'll be more tidy next week. Who can tell? Come back and see. But for now, don't leave your brain at the door. Bring it with you. Bring your questions. If there's something that I say or raise that you don't agree with, or that raises further questions for you, the opportunity through this video and all the videos that I do is to be in touch, for us to talk about that personally, if you'd like to do that, and if not, at least to shape some of the way I go about the content of these sessions, because I want them to be useful. I want them to be helpful. I want them to be interesting. I want them to be stimulating. I do want them to be challenging, and I hope they're all of those things for each of you, even just once each of them in the course of 9 weeks. There's no kind of medal at the end if you've run the marathon and got out the other side. I guess the only thing I want to say as I close as well is that this is a whistle-stop tour through thousands of pages of complex and deep history and writing and editing and ideas, beliefs, thoughts, perspectives. So it's not going to be comprehensive in any way. It is really just a skimming of the surface of what's in there. And I will also be, through the course of this series, suggesting places to go if you'd like to grab hold of, not the whole thing, which is quite useful for squashing spiders, but quite daunting in many other ways. How you grab hold of maybe just a part of Scripture and begin to explore that bit that interests you right now, as part of discovering more about yourself, about other people in history and their views, perceptions, ideas, experiences of God, or what they thought was God, and that'll be good for you and good for me, and therefore good for us, because we're continuing all the time to craft our community together, whether it's the church community or wider society. Our thoughts, beliefs, actions, and the places we go for the foundations of those really matter. So there you are, week number 1. A lengthy and hopefully slightly entertaining introduction. If you'd like to come back for next week, you're very welcome to do so. The video will appear quite late on Thursday, or occasionally possibly on Friday morning, depending on how my Thursday goes with regards to other commitments. But it will be there every week for the next 8-9 weeks, and I look forward to the challenge of preparing and presenting, and I hope you look forward to receiving what I have to say. God bless.